We will continue from where we stopped at part one. For some readers, I dare say, the word institutions conjures up a Victorian vision of lunatic asylums. Poor old Neil, he's in an institution now. That is not the kind of institution I mean. I'm talking about, for example, political institutions like the British Parliament or the American Congress. When we talk about democracy, we are in fact referring to a number of different interlocking institutions, people sticking pieces of paper into ballot boxes, yes, their elected representatives making speeches and voting in a large assembly hall, yes, but those things alone do not automatically give you democracy. Outwardly, the legislators of countries like Russia and Venezuela are elected, but neither qualifies as a true democracy in the eyes of impartial observers, not to mention those of local opposition leaders. Just as important as the act of putting crossed or stamped papers in a in ballot boxes are the institutions, usually parties, that nominate candidates for election. Just as important as the parties are the official civil servants, judges, and ombudsmen, those whose responsibility it is to ensure that the elections are fair. And then it matters hugely how the legislature itself actually operates. A body of elected representatives can be anything from a wholly sovereign entity as the British Parliament was until European law began to encroach on it, to an impotent rubber stamp like the old Supreme Soviet. Its members can stoutly uphold the interests of their constituents, including those who voted against them, and they can be in hoc to the invested interests that finance their election campaigns. In August 2011, as Colonel Gaddafi's regime in Libya was falling apart, a BBC correspondent in Benghazi spotted some remarkable graffiti on a wall. On the left side of the wall, there was a classically straightforward revolutionary message: "The tyrant shall fall. He is a monster." Direct to the point. But on the right side, the message was anything but simple. It read, "We want constitutional rule, and for the president to have less authority, and the 4-year presidential term should not be extended." As that quite correctly suggests, the devil in any political transition lies in the detail of the Constitution, not to mention the rules governing the Constituent Assembly that designs it. How does the legislature stand relative to the executive and the judiciary? Most constitutions spell that out. But how do the organs of civilian government relate to the military? A question of burning importance in Egypt. Nor can one stop there. Modern nation states have developed a whole range of institutions that were undreamt of as recently as 100 years ago, dedicated to regulating economic and social life and redistributing income. The welfare state is not part of democracy as the ancient Athenians conceived of it. In B's terms, the welfare state seems to create an ever-increasing number of dependent drones whom the workers' bees have to support. It It also employs a great many bees simply to transfer resources from the workers to the drones, and it seeks to finance itself by accumulating claims on the future in the form of public debt. In Chapter 1, I will consider this and other distributional aspect of democracy. In particular, I will ask if we are witnessing a fundamental breakdown in what Edmund Burke called the partnership between the generations. These days, nearly everyone claims to be democratic. I have I have even heard it claimed that the Chinese Communist Party is democratic. Capitalist, by contrast, is a word too often used as a term of abuse to be much heard in polite company. How do the institutions of democratic states and those of the market economy relate to one another? Do corporations do corporations play an active part in politics? Through lobbyists and campaign contributions, do governments play an active part in economic life through subsidies, tariffs, and other market distorting devices, or through regulation? What is the right balance to be struck between economic freedom and government regulation? Chapter 2 will address these issues. The specific question I ask is how far very complex regulation has become the disease of which it purports to be the cure, distorting and corrupting both the political and the economic process. A crucial institutional check on both political and economic actors is the rule of law. It is inconceivable that either democracy or capitalism could function without an effective system of justice, where the rules devised by the legislature can be enforced, where the rights of the individual citizens can be upheld, and where disputes between citizens or corporate entities can be resolved in a peaceful and rational manner. But which system of law is better, common law or some other form? The rule of Sharia is clearly very different from the rule of law as the English political philosopher John Locke understood it. In some ways, the key to comparing different codes of laws is what might be called the laws of rules. The laws of rules. the way that the way that law itself is made. In some systems like Islam, the rules have been prescribed in considerable detail for eternity by a divinely inspired prophet. According to the strictest school of Muslim thought, they cannot be changed. In others, like the English common law, the rules evolve organically as judges weigh up the competing claims of precedent and the changing needs of society. Chapter 3 will ask the question whether one system of law, in particular the common law, is superior to the others. I will also ask how far the English-speaking world still enjoys an advantage in this respect. In particular, I want to warn that the rule of law is in danger, at least in parts of Anglosphere, the degenerating into something more like the rule of lawyers. American really better served by their legal system than Englishmen were by theirs at the time of Dickens' Bleak House. Finally, there is civil society. Poorly understood, properly understood, it is the realm of voluntary association, institutions established by citizens with an objective other than private profit. These can range from schools, although in modern times most educational institutions have been absorbed into the public sector, to clubs dedicated to the full range of human activities, to aeronautics, to zoology. Once again, we encounter the importance of rules, though here they may seem trivial. like the obligations on members of most London clubs to wear ties and keep their jackets on at dinner, even on a sweltering hot evening. There was a time when the average Briton or American belonged to a startling large number of clubs and other voluntary societies. It was one of the features of the English-speaking world that most impressed the great French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville. But in chapter 4, I shall ask why that is no longer true, and how far it is possible for a truly free society to flourish in the absence of the kind of vibrant civil society we used to take for granted. Are the new, so- are the new social networks of the internet, in any sense, a substitute for traditional association of life? I shall argue they are not. Why institutions fail. This is the next subsection. Why institutions fail. If we are like bees in the realm of politics, playing our assigned parts in an essentially hierarchical hive, we have more freedom of action. In the economic sphere, there our institutions recall the wildlife of the Serengeti, the endless plains of northern Tanzania and southern Kenya. Some of us are wildebeest, grazing as we move in herds. Others of us, rather few, are predators. I'm afraid there are some scavengers and parasites too. The whole thing is an ecosystem in which Darwinian forces are constantly at work, naturally selecting the fittest from the unfit. Likewise, in civil society, we form our groups and bands rather than in the way so that rather in the way that chimpanzees and baboons do. Like the clubs we humans used to be so fond of joining, a baboon troop has its rules and hierarchies. Of course, there is no law governing the wild animals of Africa other than the proverbial law of the jungle. We humans are different. While part of our lives may be spent in a Darwinian struggle, we do expect there to be laws or rules. Rules to constrain our rulers, rules to constrain the predators and the parasites who prey on the herbivores. The rules of law, properly understood, has no real analog in the non-human world. The nearest I can think of is the man-made infrastructure that surrounds us, shaping the landscape, sheltering us and constraining us. The law sets parameters in the same way that walls and fences do. This way is much too steep. That way you risk drowning. Some systems of law resemble centrally planned cities like Moscow's, with its wide avenues and homogenizing apartment blocks. Others are more like London, an unplanned complex of irregular streets and idiosyncratic buildings, the organic product of centuries of building and rebuilding by private and public property owners. What makes humans so very interesting to study, the reason I am a historian and not a zoologist, is that our lives combine all of these elements. We exist simultaneously in a bewildering number of institutions. We are at one and the same time citizens, residents, taxpayers of the states, shareholders, managers, or employees, litigants, defendants, judges, jurors, club members, officials, and trustees. Homo economicus is only one of the many parts we play. The key point is that not all sets of institutions, when you add up the sum of parts, are equal. There are good and bad combinations. In some sets of institutions, people can flourish freely as individuals, as families, as communities. That is because the institutions effectively incentivize us to do good things. Like, for example, inventing new and more efficient ways of working or cooperating with our neighbors rather than trying to murder them. Conversely, there are institutional frameworks that have the opposite effect, incentivizing bad behaviors like killing people who annoy us, or stealing property we covet, or idling away our time. Where bad institutions pertain, people get stuck in vicious cycles of ignorance, ill health, poverty, and often violence. Unfortunately, history suggests that there are more of these suboptimal frameworks than there are good frameworks. A really good set of institutions is hard to achieve. Bad institutions, by contrast, are easy to get stuck in. And this is why most countries have been poor for the most of history, as well as illiterate, unhealthy, and bloody. I admire contemporary social scientific work that distinguishes between open and closed sets of institutions. But as an historian, I find that distinction too simplistic. For one of the puzzles of modern history is that successful societies, like 18th century England, often had institutions that today most people would be inclined to condemn already. By the time of the Victorians, Hanover, Hanoverian England looked shockingly corrupt in retrospect. And even in the 1850s, to Charles Dickens, England's rule of law was still an object of derision, not admiration. Moreover, the historical approach reveals a point that is often overlooked. It is certainly desirable that societies with bad institutions should get better ones. We see that process going on today all over the world, in much of Asia, in parts of South America, and even in Africa. But there is a more insidious process that is going on at the same time, whereby societies with good institutions gradually get worse ones. Why is this? Who exactly are the enemies of the rule of law? The people responsible for the marked deterioration that I detect in our institutions on both sides of the Atlantic? My answer to these questions owe a considerable debt to a now large body of academic literature. Major influences on my thinking includes Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics for his work on institutions, the preeminent economist and modern Africa, Paul Collier, author of The Bottom Billion and Plundered Planet, Fernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist and author of Mystery of Capital, Andres Selfer, Andrea Selifer, and his numerous co-authors who have pioneered an economic approach to the comparative study of legal systems, and Jim Robinson and Darren Acemoglu, who booked whose book Why Nations Fails ask similar questions to the ones that interest me. I owe these and the other scholars acknowledge in the notes a deep intellectual debt. However, they would be the first to agree that much more attention has been paid to the question of why poor nations stay poor, as opposed to the question of why rich nations revert to poverty, a somewhat less common phenomenon. My concern here is not with economic development, but rather with the opposite of the process of institutional degeneration. My overarching question is, what exactly has gone wrong in the Western world in our time? I answer that question on the beliefs that until we understand the true nature of our degeneration, we will be wasting our time applying quack remedies to mere symptoms. I am also actuated by the fear that paradoxically the economic stationary state have dangerously dynamic political consequences. That is for the introduction chapter for this book, and we'll continue in our next chapter.